Hello, everybody. Welcome to this lunch lecture. I am Sabri Drenez, and I will be hosting today's lunch lecture about misinformation. Our speaker today is Dr. Sacha Altay, who I will introduce in a few minutes. But first, let's talk about EDMO and the lunch lectures. So, EDMO, as most of you know, is the European Digital Media Observatory, which brings together fact-checkers, journalists, experts, media literacy experts, and academic researchers to tackle, fight, or understand better disinformation. And within EDMO, there are several organizations, and this one is EDMO BELUX, which is the hub that focuses on Belgium and Luxembourg. And within that project, within that context, we organize lunch lectures, which is a series of webinars that are aimed at understanding better disinformation and disinformation-related topics, such as today's topic. So today we will listen to Dr. Sacha Altay. He holds a PhD in cognitive science, and he is currently doing a postdoctoral research at the University of Zurich. He's working on misinformation, trust, and social media. He approached misinformation from different perspectives with an extensive work of impactful published papers in communication and psychology journals that I recommend to read, of course. So today, Dr. Sacha Altay will talk about misinformation, how is it framed, how it could be framed, because sometimes we frame misinformation as the cause of many problems, maybe with a lack of nuances, without taking into consideration the more complex, bigger picture. And it will also bring some practical recommendation for a better information environment. The presentation will be about 40 minutes long and will be followed by a discussion. So everyone feel free to react and ask questions in the dedicated space in the chat. And I will use these comments to feed the discussion. So don't hesitate. Sacha, the floor is all yours. Thank you.
Yep, perfect. I share my slides. Up.
Yes, we see them.
Perfect. So thanks for the invitation. So my name is Sacha Altay, and today I will invite to rethink the problem of misinformation. So what I will do mainly is challenge three common narratives about misinformation. The first one is that people consume and share a lot of misinformation, that people are gullible and believe anything, and that misinformation has a strong influence on behaviors. And I won't have the time, but there's a bonus one on AI misinformation apocalypse, but I won't have the time. So my first point is that misinformation consumption is actually quite low. There have been many studies now since 2016 showing that the average internet users consume very few misinformation understood as unreliable news, information coming from sources that are untrustworthy or unreliable. So like very broad definitions of like anything that may not be accurate. And these very broad definitions find that on Facebook, Twitter, on the websites that people go, basically misinformation is very small. In Western democracies, this definition of misinformation broadly understood, misinformation represents approximately 5% of all the news and information people get about politics and what's going on in the world, and only 0.15% of all the information that people consume. But I think to truly understand how small misinformation is, you need to understand how small news is and how little people are interested in politics and what's going on in the world. In France, for instance, the average internet users spend less than 5 minutes a day consuming news online. It's less than 3% of the time they spend on the internet. On average, they spend more time watching pornography, for instance, than consuming news online. And of course, you have many activities like entertainment, online shopping, etc., that are much higher in people's order of priority compared to consuming news and being informed about politics or these topics that misinformation tackles. In the US, it's the same. The average internet users consume less than 10 minutes a day consuming news online. And when we look at political news in particular, it is a small subset of all the news that people consume. And when we look at political partisan news, that is political news that is slanted and that is clearly in favor of one group or another, it's even smaller. It's like 0.36% of all the news that people see. And it's also important to keep in mind that most people online, when they are on social media, are lurkers in the sense that they do not feel comfortable sharing or posting about political events or social issues or many of the topics that misinformation tackles. So first, you have a lot of people who are not on social media, and the people who are on social media, most of them are lurkers. They do not post and they do not frequently talk about these topics. Instead, what we see on social media is a small minority of very active people who share and talk a lot about certain topics, and it can give us the impression that they are very present. And I think it's the case with misinformation. You have a very small minority of very active people who are very vocal about their beliefs, such as conspiracy beliefs, and so they give us the impression that there are many of them, even though I think there is a silent majority who is very reasonable and moderate, who we do not see on social media. And here I don't want to blame social media too much because there is no evidence that this is different offline. Like, for instance, if you're at a party, maybe the people who are the most politically engaged are going to talk more, are going to be more vocal. So it's not clear that it's something that is amplified by social media. It may be something more general about human nature, that people who are more politically engaged are more vocal, and so they give us a wrong overview of what other people actually believe, because most of us are just silent and moderate. I think this has a few implications on how we think about tackling the problem of misinformation. I think the first implication is that many people hold false beliefs not because they have been exposed to misinformation and believed misinformation, but simply because they have not been exposed to reliable information or disbelieved it. In other words, I think many people are uninformed and have false beliefs simply because they are just not very interested in most topics such as politics, health, etc. And I think that given the low prevalence of misinformation, interventions against misinformation are bound to have minimal effects on the overall accuracy of people's beliefs, especially compared to intervention that would target reliable information. And I will give the example of such an intervention that we did with my colleague Emma and Magdalena, in which basically we try to incentivize high quality information consumption on social media. So what we did is we recruited participants in France and Germany that are WhatsApp and Instagram users. And basically we had a treatment group and a control group. In the treatment, participants were asked to follow news accounts such as France Info and Hugo Décrypte in France, whereas in the control group, participants were asked to follow accounts that do not cover the news in France, such as Marmiton or Allociné. So basically, the goal is to measure the effect of following the news on WhatsApp and Instagram compared to following non-news accounts. We had compliance measures to make sure that participants complied and followed these accounts, etc. And 2 weeks later, after having asked participants to follow these accounts, we measure the effect. Are there any differences between these groups of the people who followed news accounts and the people who did not follow news account and follow account unrelated to news? And I'm going to show you here the pre-registered results that are combined across Instagram, WhatsApp, and countries. And the little square are going to be for Instagram, the little triangle for WhatsApp. In blue will be the result for France, and in orange for Germany. So one thing that we measure is news knowledge. It's basically how knowledgeable people are about news events that appeared around the time of the experiment. What we find is that for participants who followed the news accounts for 2 weeks, they showed a small increase in news knowledge. So people were slightly more knowledgeable after having followed the news accounts. Participants were also more aware of the news, of the true news events that were happening. So we asked participants whether they were aware of news events that were happening at the moment, and participants who followed the news accounts were more likely to be aware of true new events, but they were not more likely to be more aware of false news events. They were more likely to believe true news events. So when we asked participants how accurate they find true news events without telling them that it's true, participants who followed the news were more likely to rate the true news event as true. And this was not the case for false news events. we find that participants following the news did not make participants feel more informed. And this contradicts some past results, mostly using correlational design, showing that people who consume news on social media feel more informed, even though they are not more informed. We find the opposite. We find that following the news on social media slightly increases knowledge, but does not increase feeling of being informed. And all the treatment branch increased trust in the news. So all not all participants, but in all groups, like on Instagram, WhatsApp, in France and Germany, in all treatment branch, participants reported being more trusting of the news. And they also reported being more trusting of each of the specific news outlets that we asked them to follow, such as France Info and Hugo Décrypte. So after having followed them for 2 weeks, participants were most trusting of the news in general and more trusting of these specific news outlets. And here's, for instance, a quote that I think is representative of the feelings that participants had toward the study. So it's a French participant saying it's a useful survey for someone like me who doesn't follow the news. I will keep one of the 2 accounts to keep myself informed a little. And it's very funny because, of course, our treatment is very minimal. It's only 2 accounts, and this person report liking it, but it's like, okay, 2 news accounts, maybe too much. I'm going to follow one. That way, I'm going to be minimally informed. And I think it well represents how most people feel about the news, like a little bit is enough. Conclusion of this study is that news on social media, WhatsApp and Instagram in this case, can help people be a little bit more informed, discerning, and trusting of reliable news outlets. I think downgrading news will have detrimental effects, such as what many meta platforms are doing at the moment. And I think in addition to reducing the visibility of misinformation, we should also, and importantly, find ways to promote reliable information. Now, second point. So I'm going to argue against the fact that people are gullible. Instead, I'm going to argue that, if anything, people are actually maybe too stubborn. So a lot of this argument is based on the work of my PhD supervisor, Hugo Mercier, and his PhD supervisor, Dan Sperber. They have this framework of epistemic vigilance, and in summary, the main idea is just that humans have a suite of cognitive mechanism allowing them to evaluate communicative information, and that basically humans are rational. Let's simplify. Another big part of this argument is the literature in political science on the effect of political persuasion. Because in the US, for instance, a lot of money is being spent on advertising, on political campaigns, and so there have been many studies trying to estimate the effect of political advertisement on voting behaviors, voting preferences, etc. And despite all the money being spent to persuade voters, the general consensus is that these effects are very, very small. And often, like in this study in the bottom left, you need 2 million participants basically to detect effects, because these effects are extremely small. And it doesn't mean that political advertisement doesn't work and that the effects are zero. It's just that these effects are very small. And all these studies frame these effects are, well, these effects are not null, but they are so small that it's not clear that they matter, and they clearly are smaller than what people think when they think about political advertising. Another line of arguments to say that people are not gullible and are instead stubborn is that in many countries and Western democracies like France, where the news ecosystem is pretty good, people do not trust the news. And often when we think about misinformation, we worry about social media, but people report trusting news on social media even less than news on news outlets or on TV, for instance. It's what Richard Fletcher and Rasmus Kleis-Nielsen have called generalized skepticism. Like when people see news on social media, they tend to be skeptical. They also tend to be skeptical of how the algorithm filter and curate news on social media. Another point that made me think that people are too stubborn and not too gullible is that when you look at, these are basically graphs showing the correlation between how much Democrats and Republicans trust news outlets compared to fact checkers. And basically what we see is that at the bottom here, most mainstream news outlets in the US is trusted much more than fact checkers than both Democrats and Republicans, with the exception of Fox News. But basically, people trust mainstream news less than fact checkers. And fact checkers, their job, is to evaluate the quality of these news outlets. So to me, it's indication that, okay, maybe people could trust these mainstream news outlets more if experts do trust them. Another thing that worries me is that news avoidance is growing. So this is data from the Digital News Report. Every year they do this very big international report on attitudes towards the news. And what they find last year is that they find a rise in selective news avoidance. 39% of participants now say that they sometimes or often avoid the news. Interest in the news is falling as well. In 2017, 63% said that they were very or extremely interested in the news. In 2024, this number is down to 46%. In some countries like France or the UK, the decline is very steep. In the UK, for instance, the decline has been 32 percentage points between 2015 and 2024. And in some countries, it is pretty stable, like the Netherlands or South Korea. But the global trend is that, in general, people are reporting being less interested in the news. And this is a very different literature. It's a literature on how people use information and how they learn. And basically, they contrast two type of information. It's either information that's internal, so it's your own beliefs, your own experiences, and your own intuitions, compared to information that is communicated by others. And the general consensus in this literature is that people underuse social information and overuse their own information. So basically, the idea is that we give too much credit and too much weight to our own intuitions and our own experiences compared to social information. And so in this literature, they talk, for instance, about social information waste, in the sense that social information is immensely valuable, yet we waste it because we give too much weight. Basically, we trust ourselves too much. And now I'm going to briefly present the results of this meta-analysis where we looked at how people evaluate true and false news. So basically, since 2016, there have been many studies exposing participants to these kinds of news where basically, so it's kind of in a Facebook format with an image and a title and a small description sometimes. And you ask participants without telling them whether the news is true or false to rate it. Like, how accurate is the claim is this in this headline? And so we meta-analyzed all these studies. So it's 67 papers across 40 countries. And what we found is that, on average, people are able to discern between true and false news, in the sense that participants rated true news a lot more accurate than false news, even though, of course, we did not tell participants whether the news were true or false. And in all the countries in this meta-analysis, except South Korea and Serbia, participants were able to discern between true and false news, and these effects are very large for psychological effects standards. And we find the same effect at the individual level. When we look individually whether all the participants are able to discern between true and false news, we find that 80% of participants have a positive discernment score and are able to discern true from false news, even based on very minimal information that is, as I showed you, an image, a title, and often a source. But participants made mistakes. And what we found is that participants made slightly more errors on true news than on false news. In other words, participants were slightly more likely to rate true news as false rather than rating false news as true. So participants tended to show too much skepticism. This effect is much smaller, and as you can see, it's much more diverse. But in most countries, you can see that participants show what we call a skepticism bias, that is making more mistakes on true news rather than false news. And only in a few countries, participants show what you could call a gullibility bias, which is making more mistakes on false news. And at the individual level, basically 60% of participants showed what we could call a skepticism bias and 35% a gullibility bias. So summary from this study is that people can discern true from false news and err on the side of skepticism rather than credulity, although the effect is quite small. And I think it's well encapsulated in the words of this participant saying, I'd rather not believe something that is true than believe something that is actually false. And I think for reputation management consideration, if I, for instance, believe a fake news, you will think I'm a bit stupid. It's like, oh, Sacha fell for a fake news. Whereas if I express skepticism towards an article of the New York Times or France Info or the BBC, you may be, oh, Sacha may actually be, I don't know, a bit skeptical or a bit cynical, but maybe he has a point. And we know that people conflate cynicism with intelligence. Even though there is actually no correlation between the two, appearing cynical makes you look smart, which may be a reason why people err on the side of skepticism rather than gullibility. And this has a few implications for how we think about the problem of misinformation. I think there is more room to improve trust in reliable sources than to reduce trust in unreliable sources. We know that people trust scientists, but they do not trust journalists, and there are a lot of people or sources, even like Wikipedia, that people do not trust a lot. And I think there's a lot of room to improve trust in these sources. And I think instead of teaching lay people to be more critical than they already are, which is, I think, a lot of what the media literacy is doing, is like explaining media bias, etc. And of course, it's good and it's important to teach people that, but we should also explain the value of the journalistic approach and why we should trust journalists and the media. So I think it would be more fruitful to make people more trusting of the good stuff. But of course, it implies that there is some good stuff out there, and in some countries, there may not be a lot of good stuff, or the good stuff may be hard to find. I will now present you briefly a study where we tried to do this, try to focus on the good stuff instead of the bad stuff. So you may know that Facebook has been doing these media literacy tips that look something like this, where basically they try to prompt participants to be skeptical and to evaluate information on Facebook skeptically. So they say, for instance, be skeptical of headlines. This is a typical media literacy tips on Facebook. And what we try to do is, what if we framed these tips positively to try to increase trust? So instead of telling participants to be skeptical, we told them be trusting of the news. Most stories are reliable. And we also tested the effect of a mixed media literacy tips where we tried to balance skepticism towards the bad stuff and trust towards the good stuff, basically. And we tell them, for instance, pay attention to headlines, look for more information, investigate the source, etc. And so we exposed participants to true and false news and asked them to evaluate how accurate the headlines were. And some participants estimated how willing they would be to share these headlines. And what we find quite encouragingly is that compared to a control condition with no tips, in all the three conditions, in the mix, the skepticism, and the trust, all the media literacy tips increased sharing and accuracy discernment. So after reading these small media literacy tips, participants were slightly more discerning in terms of rating the accuracy of the headlines and more discerning in their sharing decisions. And bonus, the trust condition also slightly increased trust in traditional media, which I think is good in most countries. So basically, there is no need to frame these media literacy tips only in a negative way. They could also be framed in a way to improve trust. And of course, I'm not saying we should go for the trust one, but perhaps the mixed, a balance between trust and skepticism would probably be good. My last point, and probably the most controversial and difficult to make, is that I'm going to argue against the fact that misinformation has a strong influence on behaviors. So after the 2016 election, many blamed fake news for the election of Trump. They blamed fake news and misinformation for the Brexit, and many thought that COVID misinformation was literally killing people. And I'm going to briefly argue that misinformation is mostly a symptom of deeper problems. So for misinformation to have an effect, people must first be exposed to it. People must accept it after have been exposed to it, form a misbeliefs based on this piece of information that has been accepted, and then they must act accordingly. I will argue that the specific form that cultural misbeliefs take is indeed shaped by misinformation, but that there are attitudinal and structural roots that explain both the consumption of misinformation, the acceptance of misinformation, and the behaviors that are being ascribed to misinformation. So I agree that if some people believe that vaccines cause sterility, it is because of misinformation. Most people probably did not come up with this specific misbelief on their own. It is because of misinformation. And in public discourse, this is often taken as evidence that misinformation has a causal effect. However, information exposure is not random. People selectively expose themselves to information they are likely to agree with. And there are attitude roots that explain why people get exposed to misinformation in the first place, such as people's political identities, values, and worldviews. So selective exposure is a well-documented mechanism in media studies, and we know, for instance, that people with very unfavorable views of vaccines are 9 times more likely to visit vaccine-skeptical webpage than people who have favorable views. And during the final weeks of the 2016 US election, most of the misinformation was pro-Trump and was consumed by pro-Trump individuals. In their review of the misinformation literature, Budak and Al document a pattern of low exposure to false and inflammatory content that is concentrated among a narrow fringe with strong motivation to seek out such content. So there is a small minority who account for most of the misinformation shared and consumed online, and these people have strong motivation to look for this information. And some may think, oh, but maybe it's because of the algorithm or, I don't know, some kind of external factor. At least when it comes to Google search, Robertson and al. Found that exposure to and engagement with partisan or unreliable news happens not because of algorithmic curation via Google, but because of users' own choices. And here I could have added some studies on YouTube finding the same, that of course the algorithm has an effect, but it doesn't explain why like people radicalize or fall like in the rabbit hole or whatever. It's because of people's choice. Of course, it's a complex interaction, but I think people's agency and choice in this matters a great deal. And importantly, people are very motivated to engage with misinformation. They actively look for misinformation. They use it to define themselves, and they proudly harbor it online in their bios, for instance. And that's why I think people do not fall into the rabbit hole, they jump in and dig. Basically, a lot of the metaphors we use to talk about online influence are very passive. It's like, oh, people are getting influenced, people are getting radicalized by the algorithm, etc. And I think it really undermines how active people are in this process. And now, holding exposure to misinformation constant, I think attitude roots also explain why some accept misinformation when exposed to it, while others reject it. Because of course, when you're exposed to misinformation, I've been exposed to a lot of misinformation because I work on misinformation, but I do not accept the misinformation. So what explains why people accept it? And I think it's again attitude roots. And that's what I call selective acceptance. It has many terms in the literature, but just to give an example, false rumors that Obama is a Muslim resonated with Republicans. So Republicans many believed the rumor, but it had no effects on Democrats. And it had no measurable effects on behaviors or voting behaviors because Republicans were already not going to vote for Obama. And misinformation, for instance, about election fraud during the 2020 elections resonated with many Republicans because they were angry that their candidate lost, but they were, of course, very unpersuasive to Democrats who did not buy it at all. And people believe and share misinformation to fulfill political goals. And this happens because they are in environments that are politically polarized. So the more you live in an environment that's politically polarized, the more you're going to have this need to believe and share political misinformation that often depicts the outgroup negatively. People also believe and share misinformation just because they're angry at the government and distrust institutions and the establishment. Viterlen and al. Find that spreading disinformation, for instance, is a symptom of perceptions of societal injustice expressed in anger towards the government. And in this French study, they looked at climate denialists on Twitter in France. And when the pandemic happened, they found that the people who were climate denialists shared all of a sudden anti-vaccine content. And when the Russian attacked Ukraine, they all of a sudden shared Russian propaganda. And I think it kind of shows that they are going to go against the dominant narrative, they are going to go against the institutions, and it's well encapsulated in the kind of memes that they use, basically mocking people just supporting the establishment. But what they do is it's just exactly the opposite. It's a mirror of the establishment. So the content does not matter. What matters is that it is supported by the establishment, so they are going to go against it. And of course, every time you have a problem like science rejection, the rise of populism, etc., you have misinformation. Every time you have misinformation, so I think it's very tempting to be like, well, then it's because of misinformation. And I think misinformation is basically the visible part of the problem. It's the leaves of the tree. It's people saying, oh, vaccines are toxic. And of course, it's good to take care of this. Like, I'm not saying we should ignore the leaves, but I think we should look at the big picture and understand why is the tree growing in the first place? What are the roots that allow this tree to grow? And here, I think it becomes much more complex, and you need to look at social identities, people's ideologies, their values, etc. And then I think ultimately you need to understand what's the reason why the tree is growing in the first place and the systemic factors that allow the roots to grow. And studies show, for instance, that people who live in more corrupt countries are more likely to believe in conspiracy theories. And why is that? Of course, you have more reason to believe conspiracy theories when your elites are corrupt, because simply they are more corrupt. And so I think that one simple thing to reduce belief in misinformation and conspiracy theories is just to have better institutions, less corruption, less polarization, more press freedom, etc. And basically, in my model, what I invite is, instead of just focusing on misinformation, is to look at these attitude roots and these structural roots that explain, I think, why people get exposed to misinformation, why they accept it, and why they act on it. It has a few implications for how we think against misinformation. I think there will be misinformation as long as people do not trust institutions, are effectively polarized, or basically as long as they have reasons to consume and believe misinformation. If there is a demand for misinformation, this demand will be met. And I think most interventions against misinformation are doomed to play a game of whack-a-mole, where as soon as you debunk one information, another one will pop up. And I'm not against fact-checking. I'm not, of course, like symptoms can have effects. And so I'm not saying we should totally ignore the symptoms, but at the same time, we should, I think, not lose track of the fact that perhaps there is a disease behind the symptoms, and we should not just focus on the symptoms. A few concluding remarks. I think it's important to remember that people are not stupid, and there is no quick fix. That we should not reduce complex problems like vaccine hesitancy or the rise of populism to vague concepts like misinformation, social media, or generative AI, or algorithms. And I think that while treating the symptoms can help, we should not lose track of the big picture and of the root causes of the problem. Thank you.
Thank you for this presentation. Really, really dense and interesting. I think there are really different perspectives that could help us think differently about misinformation. We had a few questions in the chats. Something that I will ask you first is how do you define misinformation? Because we talked a lot about misinformation. Some people would say that depending on the scale of the definition, we could say that misinformation has effects or not. So what's your perspective on it?
I mean, I have the classic umbrella definition that's like false or misleading information that's spread without necessarily the intent to cause harm, in opposition to disinformation where you have an intent to cause harm. I'm sympathetic to this argument, but I do not think that the broader definition of misinformation you have, the more effects it has. I think one thing the field is starting to do is to say, okay, we do not care whether the information is false per se. What matters is whether the information is presented basically in a faithful way. So basically, not only we should not only care about information that is false, but also information that is presented in a way that is misleading, for instance. And to me, this is very reasonable, but it goes back to theories in media effects about agenda setting, about framing, and all these things are very well known, but to me, they have little to do with misinformation. Is that, of course, when you report about what's going on in the world, you need to make choices about what to cover, when not to cover, how to cover it. And yeah.
And also some people who say that we could think about misinformation with the idea of talking about news production and diffusion, but also talking about maybe the first sources, like for example the politics that have misinformation spreading all over their discourses. What do you think about that?
I think it's very important to not focus only on like. Should I stop sharing my slides, by the way, or is it okay?
Oh yeah,
I
maybe stop
yeah.
it. So yeah, thank you.
So I think it's very important to not focus too much on individual like social media users and to focus on powerful individuals like politicians who I think have much more influence when they share misinformation. And even if people do not believe the misinformation, we know that politicians can use information as sign of like group affiliation, or they can instrumentalize scientific findings, and they can do a lot of very bad things. And so I'm very, and that's also one reason why I like fact checking, is that it can help hold powerful people accountable, and I think that's very important. But again, to me, it's kind of a basic lesson of like the media literature, and it's very old. It's like, yeah, we should hold these powerful people accountable, and it has always been the rule of the news media to do that, and so I support that fully. But again, to me, it's not necessarily related to misinformation, because again, it's not just about false information or misleading. It's about all the bad behaviors that powerful people can have on institutions, on democracy, etc.
Thank you. One of the questions in the chat was about that part, the definition of misinformation, because here we are in EDMO is mostly about disinformation. How do you differentiate misinformation and disinformation? Does it has an effect also on the way we are framing this kind of question?
I think I've said it. Just the difference, the classic difference is the intent. Like behind disinformation, there is an intent to cause harm, whereas behind misinformation, it's not necessary. But in practice, when we look at digital traces, it's very hard to know whether there was an intent to cause harm, and even if something was coordinated. I mean, of course, you can in some way you can sometimes find it out, but if you study big scale social media data, etc., it's very hard to say, okay, this person really had an intent to cause harm. Or so that's why most researchers use the term misinformation rather than disinformation, even though again misinformation is quite vaguely defined as false or misleading, and there are some disagreements about what counts as exactly false or misleading.
Okay, thank you. Other questions were about something that I thought was really interesting too, is maybe the link between the spread of misinformation and the fact that people have less and less interest in news. You said that not a lot of people are reading news or following the
Mhm.
news, and that there is that kind of skeptical perspective on news
Mhm.
because of the spread of misinformation. Um, so we could say that misinformation have a role on reduced interest in news and information, right? So maybe because it's a larger cognitive effort of having information, knowing that there is a lot of fake news, so we have to select the information, etc. So if we are not that much interested in news, maybe we will be more focused on avoiding all kind of news, whether it's fake news or real news. What do you think about
Yeah,
it?
it's a possibility. To be honest, I'm not fully convinced. I think when you look at the data as to why people avoid the news, etc., it's mostly that people at least report that it's because the news is too negative. It brings their mood down. It's a bit too heavy. Like after a long day of work, you don't necessarily want to consume like a lot of negative and very heavy news. So I think that's one reason. And of course, information overload can be. You could blame misinformation, generative AI, social media, whatever for it. I think people have been expressing fears about information overload since forever. Since the printing press, people have complained that there are too many books, too many writings, etc., and that we cannot read everything, and we are bombarded with information. I think this is a universal feeling, and I'm not totally sure misinformation adds to this. And of course, it's contextual. Like, if you live in a country where there is a lot of state propaganda and there is, like, I don't know, you need to use a VPN to access mainstream, the Western news outlets, etc., of course, then it becomes even more taxing to access reliable information. And so, in that sense, yes, at least from what I know, I'm not an expert on disinformation, but in China, they add just this very small tax on reliable information by needing people to use a VPN to access the BBC, for instance, and that often that's enough for people not to consume it because, again, most people are not interested enough in these things to use a VPN to have access to Western media. And so, yeah, taxing reliable information and flooding the zone with shit as the flooding, that's of course bad, and it can harm reliable information. And I think I didn't actually answer your question about disinformation, but there are not that many studies on disinformation, and the few ones I know are about, for instance, the Russian disinformation on Twitter, and they found again that's like a small number of people that were exposed to it, and it's people who were mostly favorable to Russia, and it had no measurable effects on like their attitude or their voting behaviors. But there is very little, like I think, good quality empirical studies on disinformation in particular.
So when someone in the chat say that maybe we are into a news ecosystem where now the doubt is much stronger than trust, and that it could be one of the major risks of the disinformation issue, you will be more. You would say that it's not that impactful, right? If I understood correctly.
I mean, it depends. Again, if I think about someone like, I don't know, my mom, who's not that much on social media, she trusts mainstream news, and for her, she's not going to be exposed to misinformation in the first place. And if she is, she's going to disregard it. When I was a teenager, I believed in conspiracy theories. I shared all of them with her. She did not change her mind at all because she trusts these institutions. She's a teacher. She has no reason to believe it. So I don't know. At the margin, it could, and I'm worried that, yeah, reducing trust in reliable institutions and journalists and the news is bad, and if misinformation successfully does that, it's bad, and to some extent it can, I think. But again, I think the effects are small, and it's good to tackle this problem. But again, I don't want to focus too narrowly on this and forget about all the reasons that are, I think, more important about why are people turning away from news and why are people consuming not a lot and probably not enough of news.
And from a solution perspective, for example, for the media education perspective, someone is asking how can one combine interventions that aim to feed trust in legacy media while at the same time sharpen people's critical thinking skills?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult, and you need to find the right balance. And I think it's also about, adapting to how people consume information and moving away maybe from like simplistic discourse about, I don't know, social media is bad, influencers are bad. And then in France, you look at news influencers on social media like Hugo Décrypte, who are doing a great job, and in my study shows that has a small positive effect. And so I think we should be careful about how we talk about these things and not be too, yeah. But no, I mean, I don't know. It's difficult, but I think it's good to teach people about media bias, about framing, about agenda setting, about all this way in which the media can give wrong impression and wrong representations of the world. But we should also look about and talk about the alternatives. Like, what is the alternative to following the BBC or Le Monde or France Info? if the alternative is to base your own representation of the world only based on your experiences, on your intuitions, etc., then it's going to be much worse. Like on average, the BBC and France Info are not perfect, but they are much better than what we see and the experiences we have that are extremely unrepresentative of what's happening in the world.
And on that media producer side, for example, what could the today's newsmaker do about maybe the way the content is presented? Is there a crisis of professional newsmakers, editors, journalism?
I mean, yeah, I did my postdoc at the Reuters Institute in Oxford, and they talked about this a lot. I'm not exactly an expert, but yeah, there are many crises in the field at the moment. And I don't know, one thing is, of course, to make the news a little bit more positive, or at least a little bit less heavy and more accessible to everyone. But at the same time, there are differences between what people say they want. People say they want positive news, but there are some news outlets that do mostly positive news, but people don't consume these. So I don't know exactly. And there are also talks about minorities and just people being more represented, and people like lived experiences being more represented in the news, and or the news being more giving more like tips that people can actually implement in their daily lives. And but it's difficult. It's a whole field of research. I mean, I don't. It's difficult.
And well, that was one thing that was really interesting in your presentation is the fact that there is like a small part of the population that already believes in things and so participate in the misinformation spreading. But I have a question about how maybe we have situation where the beliefs and attitude are already there, and information knowledge maybe it's already formed, but there are some situations maybe when there are not that much beliefs or either information about some topics, some brand new emerging topic, for example. In that kind of situation, can we take into account the fact that misinformation maybe can be more harmful because there is no information about it, and people still do not know things or have attitude about these things.
Yeah, no, of course. Yeah, it's a very good point. Of course, the weaker people's priors are, the more they can be influenced. But I don't know, the case that comes to my mind is like the COVID-19 pandemic. So it was completely new. The disease was new to people. All the measures were new, etc. And of course, there was some misinformation. But overall, I actually did a study on this to look at how people consumed information during the COVID-19 pandemic, and people mainly turned to mainstream news outlets. So people turned to TF1, France 2, France Info, the BBC, the New York Times. So people mostly turned to mainstream news outlets to consume news about that. And so again, misinformation can have an effect, and I think it had effects also because, in France, the government lied about the masks. They were like, "Oh no, we don't need them, and we don't have them," and blah blah. I mean, the communication of the government was very confused, and so I think, and also a lot of people like lost their jobs, or it was difficult for them. So I think they had new attitudes, like new reasons why they wanted to believe this misinformation. So I don't know. In some circumstances, of course, the weaker your prior, the more misinformation can have an influence. But I think if the situation matters, like in the case of the COVID-19 pandemic, people are gonna mostly do the right thing and just turn to mainstream media and follow the orders.
Thank you for these answers. Maybe have one last question, unless someone on the chat want to ask question. This is the moment. For me, it is really important to have that kind of nuances you brought today, and a better, maybe a holistic understanding of the misinformation, on the misinformation causes and effects, with several other factors that are playing a role. And but some people would say that this kind of discourse about how misinformation is not that relevant, misinformation mitigation, sorry, is not that relevant, might bring, for example, public authorities to not fighting against misinformation, and we can say that maybe it's not the only reason of or factor for some effects, but maybe it's one of the multiple factors. So how can we be sure that we do not create a panic about it, but we can have like appropriate responses?
No, it's a good point, and it's just that I feel like today, maybe at the exception of the US, like people are very freaked out about misinformation. When you look at the World Economic Forum, 2 years in a row, they rated misinformation as the #1 risk in the next 2 years, in front of armed conflict, in front of climate change related risks, in front like, and to me, it's indicative. And when you ask people, oh, how worried are you about misinformation? And now because of generative AI, the fears are even stronger. And in that sense, I feel like the cursor is a bit too high. And of course, I'm not saying it should be like at the minimum, but I agree we should find the right balance. I just feel like some politicians and I think sometimes when they say, "Oh, the problem is misinformation," what they mean is just, "Oh, people are irrational. The people are a bit stupid. They don't do as I say. Oh, if only they would. And look, they have all these crazy beliefs. That must be why they don't want to vaccinate. They don't. That must be why they don't want to do that." And to me, it's a bit of lazy thinking. It's like, oh, no, it's not because people are stupid. People have reasons to distrust you. People have reasons to oppose vaccines and support populist leaders, and we need to understand these reasons. And often they are very complex and they depend across countries, and it can be about inequalities, about precarity, about a lot of things. And I think it's just I don't want misinformation to be used to do some lazy thinking about like, oh, all these problems are caused by misinformation, so if we tackle misinformation, all the problem will go away. No, it's like, of course we should tackle misinformation, but populism, vaccine hesitancy, etc., are a very deep problem, and we need to tackle them on their own. And misinformation won't solve that.
Thank you. I agree with that. We can see really like the question of the maybe the competition between different public problems and how we can have an appropriate response by defining them correctly and by maybe having a better comprehension of the big picture. So for this and for your work, I think it's really interesting to have those perspectives. There is no other question on the chat, so that brings us to the end of today's lunch lecture. Thank you again, Dr. Sacha Altay, and to all of you for being part of the discussion. The video will be online in a few days, so if people missed or want to see it again because it was really dense, they can do it. So have a nice week and see you on the next lunch lecture in September. Bye.